Hey everyone! Last week I walked you through why the Climate Prediction Center was flagging a third major heat pattern building for the back half of July, after two separate heat domes already hit the east and the west earlier this summer. That pattern has now arrived, and it's settling in exactly where the models said it would, the Gulf Coast and the southern plains. At the same time, there's a weak disturbance sitting in the Gulf that forecasters are keeping an eye on, so today I want to cover both pieces. How dangerous this heat actually is right now, and what that Gulf system could or couldn't turn into. Make sure you're subscribed before we get into it, because both of these are still developing and I'll have updates as they firm up. Let's start with what's already happening, because this isn't a forecast anymore. This is current conditions along the central Gulf Coast as of this weekend. Afternoon heat index values are running from 100 to 107 degrees, and forecasters are saying many locations could see 105 to 111 degrees by early next week, if the hotter forecast scenario plays out. That's a genuinely dangerous range. The kind of heat index that can produce heat exhaustion or heat stroke quickly if people don't take real precautions. Meteorologists covering the region have been direct that this is the biggest weather story right now, even with a tropical system also being watched. Plain language like sizzling and dangerous is showing up directly in official forecast discussions, which tells you this isn't being softened for public consumption. The advice coming directly from that coverage is straightforward. Stay hydrated, wear lightweight clothing, limit strenuous outdoor activity during the afternoon, and take frequent breaks in the shade or air conditioning. Farther inland, southeast Texas has been locked into a similar pattern for a while now. A ridge of high pressure sitting over Texas and the northern Gulf has been keeping the region hot and mostly dry, pushing most storm systems north and northeast instead of allowing typical rain relief. Heat index values in that inland zone have been running in the low hundreds. With overnight lows only dropping into the mid to upper 70s, meaning just like I talked about with the earlier heat domes this summer, there isn't much real recovery happening after sunset either. It's worth understanding why the heat index matters more than the plain air temperature, especially somewhere as humid as the Gulf Coast. Your body's main cooling system is sweat evaporating off your skin, which pulls heat away as it converts from liquid to vapor. In dry air, that process works efficiently. In humid air, the surrounding atmosphere is already close to saturated with moisture, so sweat evaporates more slowly, and your body's primary defense against overheating gets throttled right when you need it most. That's the entire reason a 95-degree afternoon with heavy Gulf humidity can produce a heat index of 110 or higher. Your body is genuinely working against something closer to that higher number, regardless of what the thermometer says. That distinction matters for recognizing danger early, rather than after it's already serious. Early heat exhaustion shows up as heavy sweating, weakness, dizziness, nausea, and headache. And at that stage, getting into shade or air conditioning and hydrating usually resolves it within a short while. Heat stroke is the medical emergency version, and it looks different. Skin that turns hot and dry rather than staying damp, confusion, a rapid pulse, or someone who has simply stopped sweating despite the heat. That combination means the body's cooling system has failed outright, and it needs immediate cooling along with emergency medical attention, not just a water break. With overnight lows only reaching the mid to upper 70s across parts of the region right now, there's also less of a natural reset happening after dark, which means heat stress can build across several consecutive days instead of clearing out each night the way it would in a drier, cooler climate. Here's the mechanism behind why this heat is settling in specifically along the Gulf Coast and southern plains rather than somewhere else. A ridge of high pressure has built over Texas and the northern Gulf, and that ridge is doing two things at once. It's suppressing rain chances by pushing storm systems away from the area, and it's allowing sinking air underneath it to compress and heat up, which is the basic mechanism behind every heat dome. When that ridge holds in place for days at a time, as this one has, the ground and lower atmosphere just keep accumulating heat with no real break. It helps to understand where a ridge like this actually sits relative to the jet stream, since that's what determines how long it tends to stick around. The jet stream is a fast-moving river of air high in the atmosphere that generally steers weather systems from west to east across the country. During summer, that jet stream naturally retreats north, and the areas south of it are left under the influence of slower-moving high-pressure ridges, instead of the faster-moving storm systems that dominate in winter and spring. When a ridge builds up underneath a northward displaced jet stream, there's often very little in the atmosphere strong enough to push it out of the way, which is exactly why heat domes in July tend to last for days, rather than clearing out in 24 or 48 hours, the way a passing cold front might. This particular ridge fits that same pattern. Nothing in the current setup suggests it's going anywhere quickly, which is part of why forecasters expect the heat to persist, rather than break within just a day or two. Forecast confidence on the exact next few days decreases a bit heading into early next week, and that's specifically because of how a weak disturbance over the northern Gulf ends up evolving, which brings us to the second half of today's story. Before we move to the tropics, it's worth mentioning the power grid, since sustained heat like this puts real strain on electricity demand across Texas. ERCOT, the grid operator for most of the state, has said heading into this summer that it believes the grid is in good shape, putting the chance of an emergency at well under 1% for the June-July window, while also forecasting a possible record peak demand above 92 gigawatts. Those two things aren't contradictory. A grid operator can expect record demand and still feel confident about reliability, provided enough generation capacity is available to meet that demand. Still, ERCOT has encouraged voluntary conservation during the hottest stretches of the day, raising your thermostat a couple of degrees in the late afternoon and evening, avoiding large appliance use during peak hours, and switching off non-essential lights. None of that is mandatory based on current guidance, but with a heat pattern like this one settling in for multiple days, it's a reasonable habit to build into your afternoon, regardless of whether an official conservation appeal ever gets issued. There's a weak area of low pressure sitting over the eastern Gulf right now, and the National Hurricane Center has put development odds at around 30% over the next 7 days. I want to be precise about what that number actually means, because a lot of tropical coverage either overstates or understates this kind of early stage system. A 30% chance of development is a real number worth tracking. It's not something to ignore, but it also means the more likely outcome, mathematically, is that this particular disturbance does not organize into a named tropical system at all. Most forecast models currently show this feature drifting north, largely away from Texas, which is part of why the concern level for Texas specifically remains fairly low even while it's being watched. The bigger uncertainty right now isn't really, will this become a hurricane? At only 30% odds, and with models keeping it disorganized, that's not the headline. The real uncertainty is where the associated moisture ends up, because that has a direct effect on which of two very different weekends people along the Gulf Coast actually get. If the system and its moisture track farther east, toward Florida's Big Bend, the central Gulf Coast stays hotter and drier, with only the typical afternoon storm pattern you'd expect in July. If it shifts farther west instead, rain chances increase, along with gusty marine winds and a higher rip current risk at Gulf beaches. Either way, forecasters are expecting scattered afternoon and evening thunderstorms through much of next week, regardless of exactly how this disturbance behaves, with temperatures staying well above average no matter which scenario wins out. I want to spend a second on this because tropical forecasting language gets misread constantly, and it matters for how seriously you take an update like this one. The National Hurricane Center issues development percentages for 2 windows, 48 hours and 7 days, and those numbers update multiple times a day as new data comes in. A system sitting at 30% over 7 days is genuinely worth watching, especially for anyone with Gulf Coast travel or outdoor plans in the coming week, but it is not a system anyone should be treating as a likely hurricane threat based on where it stands today. The reason forecasters mention it at all, even at fairly low odds, is that Gulf systems can sometimes organize relatively quickly, given how warm Gulf water typically is by mid-July, so it's the kind of thing worth a quick check-in every day or two, rather than something to fixate on. For context on the broader tropical picture, the disturbance in the eastern Gulf isn't the only thing on the board. Forecasters have also been tracking a weak system in the eastern Atlantic that just rolled off the coast of Africa near the Cabo Verde Islands, currently carrying just a 10% development chance, along with a separate low-odds tropical wave. None of these are urgent right now, but midsummer is exactly when the Atlantic basin typically starts waking up, so it's worth getting used to seeing 2 or 3 of these low-percentage systems on the map at once over the coming weeks. Most will fizzle, but part of tracking hurricane season responsibly is watching the ones that don't ignore themselves. Here's a piece of general tropical meteorology that's worth understanding, because it explains why forecasters keep an eye on even low-odds Gulf systems more closely than similar systems elsewhere. The Gulf of Mexico in mid to late July is reliably one of the warmest bodies of water anywhere in the Atlantic basin, and warm water is the fuel a tropical system needs to intensify. Because the Gulf is a relatively enclosed, shallow body of water compared to the open Atlantic, it tends to heat up faster and hold on to that heat through the middle of summer. That's part of why Gulf systems have a track record of sometimes going from a disorganized disturbance to a much stronger system in a surprisingly short window. When the surrounding atmospheric conditions cooperate, lower wind shear, deeper mid-level moisture, and weaker ridging all working together, rather than against development. None of that changes today's actual numbers. The system is still sitting at roughly 30% over 7 days, and the ridge currently in place is working against organization, not for it. But it's the reason a Gulf disturbance at 30% gets more attention from forecasters than a system with the same percentage sitting in a cooler, more open stretch of ocean. The ingredients for rapid change exist in the Gulf in a way they don't everywhere, which is exactly why check back in a day or two is the right level of attention right now. rather than either ignoring it completely or treating it as an imminent threat. It's worth walking through how a system like this Eastern Gulf disturbance actually gets monitored day to day, since the process behind that 30% number isn't just a guess. Once an area of disorganized showers and thunderstorms shows enough of a broad rotation or a closed circulation to be worth watching, the National Hurricane Center designates it an INVEST, short for investigative area, and starts running it through specialized computer models even before it has an official name. Meteorologists then look at a handful of key ingredients: how warm the ocean water is underneath it, how much wind shear is present in the atmosphere above it, how much dry air is nearby that could choke off thunderstorm development, and how organized any rotation already looks on satellite imagery. Those ingredients feed into an ensemble of different models. You may have seen the term spaghetti models, which refers to the tangle of individual model tracks plotted together on one map. When those tracks cluster tightly together, forecasters have higher confidence in both the track and the odds of development. When they spread out widely, which is closer to what's happening with this particular disturbance, that reflects genuine disagreement among the models about how the system will evolve. And that disagreement is exactly why the development percentage sits in a middle range like 30%, rather than a more confident number near the extremes. It's not that forecasters don't understand the physics involved. It's that the atmosphere itself hasn't decided which direction this particular system is going to take yet, and the models are honestly reflecting that uncertainty back, rather than papering over it with false confidence. Here's where these two stories actually connect, and it's worth understanding the relationship rather than treating them as two separate news items. The same ridge of high pressure that's baking the Gulf Coast and southern plains right now is also part of what's currently helping to keep the Gulf disturbance disorganized and steering it away from a direct hit on Texas. Strong ridging tends to create sinking air and wind shear that work against tropical development, which is part of why forecasters aren't rushing to sound tropical alarm bells even while the same weather pattern is producing genuinely dangerous heat at the surface. That relationship can flip, though, and it's worth knowing how. If the ridge weakens or shifts position in the coming week, which is a normal part of how these summer patterns evolve over a 7 to 10 day stretch, that could simultaneously ease the heat in one direction while making conditions more favorable for that Gulf moisture to organize in another. That's exactly why forecasters keep saying confidence decreases in the medium range. It's not that they don't understand the ingredients, it's that a subtle shift in ridge position over the next several days can meaningfully change both the heat forecast and the tropical forecast at the same time. If you've been following along, you know this is the third distinct heat pattern of the season, and each one has had its own character. Late June brought a heat dome to the eastern U. In eastern Canada that put more than 200 million people under some form of heat alert was tied to 44 confirmed deaths and pushed the PJM interconnection, the grid operator, covering a huge stretch of the mid-Atlantic and Midwest, close to record electricity demand during the peak of the holiday weekend heat. That one was defined by dangerously high overnight lows in major cities, which compounded the daytime heat night after night. Then a second heat dome built over the western and north central states through the first half of July, and this one was defined less by humidity and more by sheer, dry, record-shattering peak temperatures. Billings, Montana, broke its all-time temperature record outright, and Salt Lake City reached 109 degrees, topping its previous record of 107. Phoenix and Tempe held at or above 110 for multiple consecutive days during that same stretch. That heat dome's character was classic dry heat extremity, enormous departures from average, concentrated in the interior west. Now, right on schedule with what the Climate Prediction Center's extended outlook projected last week, the pattern has shifted south, and the Gulf Coast and southern plains are the ones dealing with it. This third round has its own distinct character too. Rather than record-shattering peak numbers, it's defined by persistent, humid, oppressive heat index values in the 105 to 111 range, night after night, with a tropical wildcard layered on top that neither of the first two heat domes had to contend with. 3 heat domes, 3 different personalities, all within about a 6-week stretch of the same summer. I'm not going to call this one record-breaking, because that's not the language forecasters covering it are actually using. This round is being described as dangerous and sizzling, not as a record setter, and I think it's worth being precise about that distinction rather than borrowing a label from the earlier heat domes that isn't actually being applied here. What is true is that heat index values in the 105 to 111 range are genuinely dangerous regardless of whether any individual station breaks its all-time record. And that's the number worth paying attention to, not a records tally. For anyone along the Gulf Coast or in the southern plains right now, treat the heat index number, not the air temperature, as your real guide for how dangerous a given afternoon is. Limit strenuous outdoor activity to early morning or evening. Stay well ahead of your hydration rather than waiting until you're thirsty. And check on elderly neighbors and anyone without reliable air conditioning. Heat remains the deadliest weather hazard in the U.S. on average, ahead of tornadoes, hurricanes, and lightning combined, precisely because it's easy to underestimate. If you're heading to Gulf-facing beaches this week, keep an eye on rip current risk, which tends to climb alongside any increase in onshore wind, whether or not the Gulf disturbance ever organizes into anything official. On that rip current point specifically, these currents form when water pushed onto the beach by waves, and wind needs a way to funnel back out to sea, often through a break in a sandbar, creating a fast-moving channel of water flowing directly away from shore. They're not always visible from the beach, and they can overpower even strong swimmers. If you ever get caught in one, the single most important thing to remember is not to fight it directly. Swim parallel to the shore instead until you're out of the current, then angle back in. Fighting straight against a rip current just exhausts you against a current that's often stronger than a person can outswim. For the tropical piece, there's no action needed today beyond general awareness. If you're anywhere near the Gulf Coast, this is a check back in a couple of days system, not a make a plan right now system, based on where the odds and the models currently stand. But if you already have a hurricane season plan in your household, and if you live anywhere near the Gulf or Atlantic coast, you should. This is a good reminder to make sure it's actually current. Know your evacuation zone if you have one, know where your important documents are, and don't wait for a system to reach a high percentage before you start paying attention. A basic hurricane season checklist is worth having ready regardless of what this particular disturbance does. Keep a few days of water and non-perishable food on hand, along with any medications your household needs regularly. Know your home's flood risk, since storm surge and inland flooding are responsible for the majority of hurricane-related deaths, not wind. Keep your vehicle's gas tank closer to full than you normally would during active tropical months, since evacuation routes can back up quickly once an actual watch or warning is issued, and gas stations along those routes can run dry fast. None of this takes long to put together, and like most preparedness steps, it matters far more the one time you actually need it than every other week when you don't. I'll keep tracking both halves of this, how long the Gulf Coast heat holds on, and whether that eastern Gulf disturbance does anything more than sit there. Oh, and I'll bring you an update as soon as either one changes in a meaningful way. For now, stay smart about the heat and keep half an eye on the Gulf. It's worth remembering, as we move deeper into the back half of summer, that this overlap between dangerous heat and early tropical monitoring is actually the normal shape of late July and August along the Gulf Coast. It's not an unusual coincidence. The same warm water and persistent ridging that make this stretch of the calendar so oppressive on land are also the ingredients that make the Gulf and Western Atlantic more favorable for tropical development as the season progresses. That's part of why hurricane season forecasters generally treat late July through September as the most active stretch of the year. The atmosphere and ocean are simply primed for it. None of that means every heat wave leads to a hurricane, and today's system may well fizzle out completely without ever getting a name. But it does mean that if you live anywhere along the Gulf Coast, this is a good time to treat both hazards as part of the same seasonal awareness, rather than checking in on heat all summer and only starting to think about tropical systems, once something already has a name attached to it. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it and stay safe out there.